Good morning. Colonel Don Raymond, Deputy Commandant of the U.S. Army Armor School, and here to introduce today's first speaker. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine in February of 2022 has provided many insights that will help our preparation for tomorrow's fight. Our first speaker today is a core member of the Army's Russia New Generation Warfare Study and the team that developed the threat underpinnings for multi-domain operations. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Jerry Leverich, Senior Intel Analyst, Deputy Chief of Staff, TRADOC G2.
How's that? Do we hear me okay? Sometimes I can be a little soft-spoken, so super. So my name is Jerry Leverich. I'm from the TRADOC G2. Number one, I do appreciate the opportunity to speak to such a wide and varied audience, particularly on Russia, Ukraine. And more importantly is some of the implications that we should be learning from this. Now, yesterday I know General McConville spoke and talked about some of the lessons learned that the Army's picking up. I'm going to talk in a little bit different context, so I want to talk more about the observations we're seeing, some of those implications for large-scale ground combat operations. Let's go to the next slide, please. And I'll offer that these are observations. As General Potter, the Army G2, has cautioned me, until we learn them, until we inculcate them, they're not truly lessons learned. So again, for LSCO, these are some of the things I'm going to talk through for the next couple minutes here. Number one, on the hard-to-maneuver piece, let's look at the terrain. Let's look at the area that we're actually focused on here in Europe. And there's certainly some weather as well as terrain aspects, urban areas in Eastern Europe that really affected how maneuver could be conducted in this particular area. The high casualties and the loss of leaders has been a significant issue. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, whether it's necessarily an ineptness of the Russians or whether it's a characteristic of large-scale combat operations. Logistics and the expenditures, we'll talk through some of that, how that's affected maneuver, the ability for the Russians to do some of the things that they wanted to do. Non-Contiguous and what that means for the battlefield framework, the battlefield geography of the future. Information advantage plays out in real time here, and we'll go through some aspects of that. Command post survivability, probably one of the more important things here, particularly as it pertains to our ability for mission command and what that looks like and some of the challenges that we've seen. So let's go to the next slide here. And I'll lay out the three precepts. You know, every military commander believes in this, and I believe ultimately they are true, but they deserve to be challenged sometimes. You know, number one, we are the best equipped. What we're seeing in this particular conflict is it's not necessarily about the equipment. It's about everything else except for the equipment, the doctrine, the organizations, the leader development, the training, all those competencies that the U.S. Army has that many of our adversaries are having a challenge with. Best trained, obviously. What many people forget is both Russia and China during the 90s were invited over to the United States. They've actually walked in TC, both adversaries, and saw what and how we were training. Some of them took that back. Some of them capitalized on that. It's more pronounced in the Pacific than it is in Europe. And then the best at maneuver. And I will offer that this idea of anti-axis area denial, A2AD, is purposely meant to get at our ability to maneuver, either strategically, operationally, and in some cases, tactically. And as I go through the rest of this presentation, as I talk through some of these points, I would ask, you know, how might we do these things differently? How might we overcome some of the challenges that we've seen the Russians hold? Let's go to the next slide. So without having to necessarily go back in time, in Putin's revisionist idea of the significance and the status of the Ukraine, let me offer up that this was planned well in advance. This actually started back in 2020 when the president of Ukraine actually announced his intention to join NATO. It was a strategic decision he felt that his country needed to do. That was in November 2021, in March, right as we were transitioning presidencies. Putin moved a large force to the Ukraine, or to the Russian border. That force actually stayed there throughout a whole year in preparations. And we come back until 2022 in February when all of this actually kicked off. And I'll tell you that the intel feed on this was very articulate, and you saw this play out in press as how we saw them preparing for this. Now, there's 3 phases into what we've seen to date, and why I want to highlight these phases is not necessarily the evolution and what the Russians have learned, but also how it highlights different aspects of the conflict we've seen over the last 203 days. So first phase, this was the push for Kiev along those 4 axes of advance up there. Main effort to take over Kiev, to take the leadership up there. The push through Kharkiv, the other push into from Crimea into Kherson. At the same time, holding and fixing the bulk of the Ukrainian forces in the Donbass area there. That fortunately was unsuccessful. There was a lot to be learned on that particular push. The Russians recognizing the need and the losses that they'd had, pulled their forces out of the north and instituted the southeastern offense. And that's what we've seen played out up until about 2 weeks ago, and that's in the Donbass area. The third phase, which is what we're starting to see now, and I think it's the most interesting as it rolls out right now, is actually the Ukrainian counterattack. And that started off in early September, purposely focused on the southern area, telegraphing their intent in the southern area against Kherson. And out of the blue, in a wild feat of deception, I would offer, the Ukrainians have pushed into Kharkiv. In fact, the Russians losing 5 brigades, Ukrainian brigades, that actually pulled out of the south and went north. And we're seeing that play out now. Again, the deception aspect. Ukrainians, with their feint on Kherson and then moving north into Kharkiv, but also extensive use of decoys by the Ukrainians, man pads, decoys, the whole range of efforts to lead the Russians, and I'd offer most of the international community to believe that that focus was going to be in the south. And let me talk a little bit about some of those insights that I think are really important that we've seen so far. Because it postures us as we look into the future. So number one, the Russians decided to focus on the Battalion Tactical Group as their unit of action. A little bit different from the United States Army, where we had the brigade and now we're moving towards the division. The Battalion Tactical Group was the unit of action. Their training for that, and what that resulted in was an ad hoc command relationship in this particular conflict, where they weren't fighting as brigades, divisions, and combined arms armies. They developed these 4 regional ad hoc command headquarters with multiple battalions underneath them. In some cases, corps level commands that in some cases had like 19 battalions subordinate to them. The second thing, because they focused on that battalion, their training strategy leading up until this. Now, again, I mentioned that they'd come over, they'd seen our CTCs, they replicated them, but again, they focused on that battalion, and because the nature of the Russian army is conscript and contract, they actually took those battalions and concentrated on integrating the subordinate elements of this, the company elements of this. They did not include higher echelon forces as part of their training. And what you see there is the lack of multi-echelon training that has certainly caused them some challenges. The third thing, and I think this is really, really important, is their leader experience. If you look at what happened in Mariupol with the sieges there, every general officer in Ukraine had experience in Syria. None of their BTGs have been to Syria. So when you see things like the siege on Mariupol, those were the same guys, those were the same general officers that were responsible for the siege against Aleppo. So that experience and the counterinsurgency aspect of what they had in Syria, based on their experience, is what they tried to translate into this fight. And I think there's some important things to remember about that, is particularly if you look at our focus for the last 20 years of COIN and what large-scale combat operations actually look like going into the future. All right, so let's go to the next slide. And there's been a lot of focus on the casualties, and as I understand in open source right now, 50,000, day 203, 50,000 Russian casualties. But I also want to highlight the leadership aspects, the targeting of leaders and the loss of combat commanders, for a couple reasons. Number one, is this necessarily a sign of Russian ineptness, or is this a characteristic of large-scale combat operations? And what this particular slide lays out on the left is some of the Russian statistics, but in that green box are those things that historically we've recognized from World War II in large-scale combat operations. 9th ID alone in Tunisia lost 5 of its 6 battalion commanders. And in a multitude of other examples I can give you there. And the likelihood in of losing leaders within large-scale ground combat operations needs to be accounted for. The idea of pace pans, mission command, and the ability for subordinates to step up. A lot of key lessons here in replicating and training the potential for losses. And these aren't just artillery losses or as a result of fires. In the case of Ukraine, with that battlefield geometry far behind the lines in some case, you can see there the CG of the 49th Combined Arms Army. That's essentially a corps level commander with a strike, snipers and ambushes in those rear areas. 17 general officers to date that have been killed in Russia, or excuse me, 14 in Russia. Let's go to the next slide. Let's talk a little bit about logistics, because I think this is one of the key parts in their ability to maneuver and what really stymied the Russians at the beginning. When you saw them push out of the north there, and you had on CNN, you had the 40-kilometer wide logistics trains that were all backed up. The uncoiling out of Belarus that the Russians did was a challenge for them. They led for speed. They led with combat forces forward. They did not necessarily have their UAVs forward. They did not necessarily have, while they had artillery, it was all the artillery ammunition that got stuck behind them. A number of things that compounded their issues up there in their dash for Kiev. Reconstitution and regeneration, I think, has been a real big insight as we watch Russia. Because as I talk through these 4 phases, or excuse me, these 3 phases that they've done, this is the same army that was there to begin with. So you've got battalions in many cases that have been reconstituted multiple times. Ad hoc merging of battalion headquarters and battalion formations. The integration of subsequent volunteers and additional soldiers quickly into battle. I would offer one of the biggest things that we can recognize is all of this reconstitution, regeneration, at the expense of training. So there's a Russian point, and I don't know the Russian explanation of it, but I'll give you the translation. You know, as they go through their pauses, which are not meant to exceed more than 2 weeks, and as they resume an offense, you know, the three things that they consider is, number one, is the equipment ready? And the answer is undoubtedly yes. Is there people? Are the people ready? And undoubtedly the answer is yes. And then the third requirement is training. And undoubtedly that says, well, we'll get to that later. The point is, again, this is the main force that started off with this and those heavy casualties that they've instilled. And in some cases, the drain upon the Russian military, bringing in cadres, early graduations of soldiers out of their courses, volunteers, PMCs, private military corporations like Wagner, you know, just trying to gather people together and literally after 2 weeks of training, sending them to meet their units. Let's go to the next slide, talk a little bit about non-contiguous operations. And this really speaks to the thinness of the Russian forces at this particular point and the implications of the battlefield framework. You know, there's been no limit to what the Ukrainians have been able to do, whether it's the direct actions in the rear, whether it's the long-range fires, the introduction of HIMARS into the conflict and how that has dramatically changed the battlefield, including attacks within the Russian homeland and in Crimea. Partisan operations, you know, have re-evolved and have become quite organized in those occupied areas. Partisan operations, organized resistance, and then vulnerabilities I like to highlight here, and this really gets back at that CPs and our ability to see us and see ourselves within the electronic magnetic spectrum. And in the aspects of the transparent battlefield. I think this is really important to understand because technology has become so democratized and is so available to so many at this point in time, where you see things like the Maxar imagery that's on CNN, where you see things like the commercially available artificial intelligence SIGINT capability that can actually go through scanners and identify individuals on the battlefield. The Ukrainian establishment of a cloud targeting infrastructure. Literally, you can take pictures and upload it into their national database with the geolocational aspects and nominate targets throughout the country. And then things that were not even meant for this purpose. You've got the U.S. Forestry Service and NASA that are actually publishing heat maps on the internet in the efforts of tracking fires that have almost the same resolution of some of our national capabilities in tracking infrared detection stuff. So my whole point on this is within all these different aspects and all this commercially available technology, if you can be found, and you will be, the ability to kill is very paramount there. Let's go to the next slide, talk a little bit about information advantage and its significance. And I want to talk about casualty notification because I'm not sure that the American public is prepared for this. You know, the Ukrainians established the digital graveyard. And what that actually is as a Russian soldier is killed, a picture is taken of him and he's loaded up to the cloud. In many cases, that's how families are first learn about the death or a casualty of a soldier. And if you look at how we do that in our policies and our requirements coming back, you know, for casualty notification, how this is going to turn, and we will see something like this in the future, how this will turn those policies on their heads. The digital levy en masse, you know, the alignment of these hacker groups and social media advocates, you know, anonymous siding with the Ukraine. You've got the Russian kill net that's siding with Russia. At least 9 or 10 other organizations on both sides, trumpeting messages, reinforcing different narratives, and the ability to contend with those. Talk a little bit about civilian casualties. I'll be honest with you, I don't think we have a good idea of what civilian casualties are looking like. According to the United Nations, we've got about 12,000 civilian casualties. I think over the coming days, that number is going to inflate significantly. And also this idea, you know, we characterize Russia as an artillery army with tanks. And I think that's important to understand, especially as we see them go through this conflict. Of the 198 battalions that went into Ukraine, 40 of them were artillery or fires oriented. And without the restrictions on munitions as the United States has right now, thermal barracks, clusters, some of those things that those decisions that we've imposed on ourselves to limit our use of are widely being used within Russia now. And then again, the casualty numbers. And my bottom line here is, you know, the narratives. And if you look at how this road to war has come to this point, you can literally focus on the narrative out of Russia and out of the Ukraine, and you can identify who's being targeted in this, whether it's the domestic population, whether it's NATO itself or Europe, whether it's internationally or if it's the United States itself, and how that's able and how they've been able to actually execute that. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll highlight, you know, I'm not sure that this title is necessarily an accurate depiction. I'm not sure that it's necessarily a contested air. I think more simply, the ability to manage airspace is a significant challenge, one that we haven't really had to deal with in many decades, I would offer, and the Russians are seeing that in spades right now. Complicated by, you know, the significant fratricide that the Russians have had against their own aircrafts. Talk about the standoff capabilities and recognizing that most Russian aircraft launch from Russian airspace. You know, they don't necessarily go into the Ukraine to launch these things. UAVs, very significant for targeting, for situation awareness, but not necessarily decisive, I would offer. The rack that Russia has, they don't have a tremendous depth in attack UAVs. You know, and we're quickly looking as the Russians reach out to potentially North Korea or Iran for some UAVs, how they integrate that, because that's one of the biggest challenges is integrating these things into the full conflict. And the Russians, of course, use UAVs in a very different manner than the United States, where the United States has the intel infrastructure behind UAVs. In the Russian case, UAVs work directly for the artillery. It streamlines their response times. And then a glimpse of MDO, and we see this very pronounced right now from the Ukrainian side. You know, with the introduction of anti-radiation missiles, all right, that have taken out a number of air defense systems. The bottom line is the control and the collaboration within the airspace is something to really focus on as we go forward, as one of our strengths in our joint partnership with our other services, and exercising that in a manner that assists us, whereas I'm not sure that the Russians have been very good at it. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. While the focus is on Russia, I will offer our pacing challenge is actually China. And the Chinese are watching this very carefully. Most of this stuff under the strategic aspect, I think where most people are familiar with. I really want to focus on that operational aspect, though, because I think that's probably the most important. Besides the disunity of command that the Russians exhibited, the other things that the Russians have, that the Chinese have focused on is the training aspect, the DOTMIL PF aspect. Looking at us and seeing how we do things, becoming in many cases disillusioned with how the Russians are doing things, but recognizing that there's more to it than just the equipment. Now, the Chinese started off a few years ago with an effort to focus on their leader development aspects. And they actually published this thing called the 5 incapables, or the 5 cannots, depending on your translation. And it was a critical look at themselves, leaders down, on some of the things that the Chinese military has a challenge with. Things like the inability to judge situations, the inability to understand a higher intent, the inability to make decisions, to deploy troops, or to deal with unexpected situations. I think that's key in that self-evaluation, because that really speaks to, what mission command is all about. And I think within those things, you see the deficiencies from the Russian side right now. Now, arguably, the Chinese are working to fix this, whether or not they'll culturally be able to overcome some of these things. But it really gets at the idea that what we're seeing in Russia is significant, but from our pacing challenge, how they're looking at this conflict into the future is a significant, is something that we need to continue to watch carefully. And in the tactical aspects of things, whether them recognizing they're poorly equipped, poorly trained, the Chinese do have in many cases really good kit. It's how they integrate it. The Xi Jinping has put a focus on the Chinese army on training to be as realistic as it can be. It is evolving. It's not necessarily the check the block that it used to be 25 years ago. They are instituting retraining, reps and sets, all meant to get to a higher fidelity and a higher capability within them. So that's, let's go to the next slide. If you take one thing from my presentation, I encourage you to grab one of these QR codes here. Not only is my presentation here and available for you on this particular code, but also within the 2 codes, everything that I can display or put out unclassified is there also. So whether it be the ability to engage in a community of Russian experts, whether it is the ability to interact and actually run through how they fight from the Chinese perspective, whether it's the Army training publication on how Russia or China actually fights, a number of opportunities within these different landing zones. Again, I highly encourage you. So with that, we're going to turn it over to some questions. Once again, I appreciate the opportunity here.
Sir, thank you so much for your presentation this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, we have time for one question based on the need to move on to our 4 deployed speakers next. So one question from the audience for Mr. Leverich.
Got one up here. I think we're trying to get a microphone to you.
Okay, I see you. Number 3.
Sir, thank you for your time this morning. This is Captain Johnson in MWFC. My question for you is for specifically at the company or troop level, what are lessons or things observed in the war in Ukraine that we can begin implementing to be prepared to fight in a multi-domain operation? Thank you.
So I'd offer probably one of the most important things is the training aspects and the discipline. It is the combat skills that have been a significant challenge for the Russians. I mean, when was the last time we ran an air guard during a convoy? You know, those type of things that we haven't done because our airspace or our situation was so significantly different. It's operating from FOBs. Now, it is the basic combat skills. Over.
Great, thank you, sir. That's all the time we have for this morning based on the schedule for the rest of the day. We appreciate you taking time to inform us on the threat. We must understand this operational environment first before we can plan for tomorrow's fight. Thank you very much.